From the archives of the great library of Arathes, golden city of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Frank Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Phillip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 3. "Where is our backup, Sergeant?" the partisan Lieutenant Doran Leafwater whined. "They should be here by now." "Stand your post and close that flap," the sergeant snapped back. Holding his lantern high only cast a thin light into the lanes of the bazaar and sent more of it back onto his fresh face and the crest of silken brown hair that poked from under his officer's cap. He spotted a loose thread dangling from the sleeve of his crisp grey uniform, and he plucked at it, silently cursing the cut-rate Caffrey Street seamstress, who was the only one available to tailor the ill-fitting garment on short notice, which also meant at great personal expense. It was an insult compounded by the partisan quartermaster who said it was standard-issue attire. When Doran had tried the uniform on, it hung off his narrow frame like a juggler's pavilion. But if their intention was to haze him into quitting, they would find Doran Leafwater made of sterner stuff. Doran had taken it as a point of pride that he was both the youngest recruit and newest partisan on the force. No amount of low grumbling from the others would make him apologize for having beat out the other arguably more qualified candidates. And it wasn't just the privilege of his illustrious family name either. In fact, it was hard won by a strategic campaign by his overbearing mother of called-in favors, generous bribes, and outright cajoling to gain him the coveted slot. If one must endure the indignity of labor, which most half-elves of a certain age eventually did, then one could do a lot worse than the enforcement of district and city-wide laws. Doran was convinced he could bide his time until his elevated rank afforded such a position where the only work he had to do was extend a hand out to accept a bribe. Doran sighed and kicked a loose stone that skittered into the darkness. Why did life insist upon being so hard all the time? Doran groaned inwardly. Humans had it easy. All they had to do is go about their pathetic, meaningless lives where they worked menial, if laboursome jobs, and came home to the hungry passel of their squalling, dirty brood. Their purpose was simple. They didn't have to worry about anything important like Doran did. He had to keep track of everything, their army's progress in the war, which apparently had been going well, to turmoil within the Sarmatian kingdom, and even the salacious drama within the elven society of Arathes itself. All elves had to keep track of which family names mattered, which ones were ostracized, and the relative ranking of everyone else in between. An elf with enough status didn't have to deal with indignities such as work, and certainly didn't have to take orders from any snivelling humans. It was yet another buzzing resentment that Doran harbored against his no-good father, that his own family name of Leafwater wasn't much closer to the top of that list. The fates of birth could sometimes be so cruel. It didn't stop him from dreaming one day that he would be the leader of a prominent family, maybe even breaking centuries of tradition to become the newest member of the High Council. They'd have to change the name, Doran mused idly. The 10 families as they were known each held a seat on the High Council of Arathes. They were simple enough for Doran to remember, based on the district they controlled and what each of those districts had to offer. Starting at the hill in the Summer Palace was of course High Lord Whiteleaf, the child prince. The way he was spoken of, High Lord Whiteleaf was but a whelp, barely grown into the point of his ears. He had yet to be matched with a betrothed and was therefore without official heir or progeny. He lived a dreamy existence within the walls of the palace, seeking whatever knowledge or pleasure he desired. It made Doran grind his teeth with envy every time he thought of it. As for the 10 families themselves, they were not better than the supposedly lesser elven names, and had certainly not achieved their lofty station by any act of heroism or virtue. They had just as many secrets, crimes, and scandals as Doran well knew from being in the proximity of his gossipy mother and her bored, wine-soaked friends. Without any real effort, he could immediately run through the entire reprobate list and recount what each was most notorious for. The Bellspire family was synonymous with the city's administration and laws of both the civil and magical variety, but were often given preferential treatment to allies, especially those with gold. The nefarious Twinsprigs were wealthy society elves who held no discernible redeeming qualities, and yet seemed to be invested in every single endeavour the city undertook, legal or otherwise. Apparently the city's criminal element still referred to kickbacks to the family as the Twinsprig tax. The senile old grey sages were the dusty, dried-up old library and museum elves who had their noses buried in books all their days. Their only importance seemed to bubble up any time someone had an ancient territorial dispute they wanted to settle. Then one could count on a well-bribed scholar to conveniently find the proper ancient supporting document. And their exact opposites, the gregarious and ostentatious Amberflax clan, who maintained the creative arts and theatre district, were given to so many scandals, many of them happening concurrently, that it was impossible to name a most egregious one. The Hardoaks were shrewd with business and cutthroat even between their own kin. One had to read a contract with extra care and many times over before entering a bargain with their ilk. The Coldfrosts were tough and serious-minded elves who worked in the city's industrial sector. It was a dangerous and often deadly place, especially for those who caused them trouble. The Sweet Rose family served the city's vices, such as brothels, fighting pits, and gambling dens. They were not only first-hand witnesses to much of the respected society's illicit behaviour, they frequently held the blackmail evidence to back it up. The ambitious and dangerous Fernbrook family was one to watch. They had slipped in both wealth and status following the untimely and unusual death of the wealthy Lady Fernbrook, an event that her widower husband, who had already taken the unusual step of adopting her surname upon their marriage, further added grist to the gossip mill by having led an internal purge of certain family members in the aftermath following her demise. There was Lord Mosswater and his sewer-dwelling kin living in the underbelly of the city. Their major sin, other than being uncultured, filthy and foul-smelling, was their refusal to participate in the honourable elven traditions at all. They were low both in elevation and status, for they lived beneath the dignity of what it meant to be elven kind. And finally, Blackroot. They were near traitorous for being so closely allied with humans, dwarves, and every other unsavoury non-elven creature in the city, which was as bad of a breach in protocol as could be found in Arathes. And to his deep chagrin, was unfortunately where Doran found himself stationed. Not only that, but forced to follow the orders of a human. He could not wait to secure his promotion and never come this far down into the city ever again. In this he was resolute. But he had to somehow convince his crusty old supervisor he was worthy of the partisan title first. His sergeant, a skarking human named Harland Hobb, was soft at the shoulders and sported a bushy white moustache, but supposedly had served Blackroot as long as young Leafwater had been alive. Despite the fact that he was just a human, Hobb was a veteran partisan and acquired a supposed wealth of insight and experience from his years of service, now which Leafwater was obliged to at least pretend to receive. But Doran quietly suspected he was being foisted upon this dusty relic as some kind of rite of initiation, and that meant not only a fortnight of guard duty among the lowest, vilest parts of the Blackroot district, but also the basic indignity of being under the command of a human. The grizzled old badger was very good at yelling and giving Doran a difficult time. He had no sense of the importance of elves, nor their venerated traditions of leisure time and sumptuous foods. He was boorish and mean. But Doran consoled himself that humans didn't live for that long, and old Hobb was nearly at the end of his life anyway. Perhaps he'd do Doran the very good favour of just dying. Was that too much to ask? Leafwater peered out into the darkness, trying to will the reinforcement partisans into existence, but the lantern light this close only made his vision swim with opaque, chromatic blobs. A whole unit of Tigran war riders could have been approaching, and he wouldn't have seen it until the very last. The half-elf decided he was fine with being night-blind, however. Anything was more preferable than looking down at the revolting body at his feet. The pathetic old human lay collapsed, a large mountain of flesh, lying face down on the stones. He had a long, ratty skirt of grey hair that ringed his bald dome, mostly covering his features. Not that his identity mattered whatsoever. No human warranted this amount of fuss, especially not one who was unceremoniously doused in such a way. There was a long dagger protruding from his back, and dark blood soaked his white tunic and pants glossy black in the dim light. It made a wide pool out from his body, tracing the seams and cracks of the cobblestones like some unholy mortar, congealing in a viscous gore underneath him. It was the old man's eye that was particularly upsetting, turned toward him with a surprised, questioning look, the same way that the foul-smelling livestock looked as they were driven from Pelusian barges into the auction pens of Arathes harbour. That eye, that single terrible eye peering out from the thicket of long hair, was wrong in a way Leafwater couldn't describe. Just dull pools of darkness. It made his stomach roil. He had to tow the man's hair over it with his boot to cover that horrible, accusatory gaze. As a half-elf raised in the elven philosophical tradition, Leafwater knew he was supposed to feel pity for the death of a lesser creature. But seeing this bloated beast up close, he could only conjure disgust. All the blood, with its coppery smell, and Leafwater had to stand here and endure it. What's one more dead human? He might as well be standing guard over the carcass of a dog. When he had expressed his reasonable misgivings to the sergeant earlier, the old man's face went red, and Doran actually thought the fool was going to hit him. A distant bell tolled 5 strikes, and the horizon was just starting to show signs that this night might be over. Leafwater clenched his jaw and stole a glance over his shoulder. "Hear that? It's been an hour, and we're left standing out here like some hoddy, round-eared valets." Doran expected some kind of sharp retort, but Sergeant Hobb didn't acknowledge the insult. He was 20 paces away near the bakery, and his focus was not on the petulant lieutenant. He stood, looking like a man ready to defend himself, his scarred hands subtly gripped and re-gripped the metal baton. The sergeant's full and focused attention was on the ominous murder suspect at his feet, the elven suspect. When they arrived at the scene, Hobb and Leafwater had found him right where he was now, seated with his back to the wall and tilting drunkenly. Sergeant Hobb had asked if the elf had seen what happened to the dead man, and he freely admitted to the killing. He seemed proud of it. Leafwater was new to the study of law, but even he knew that there would be repercussions for such a brazen act, even for an elf. Doran watched as the elf stretched his legs out laconically and crossed them at the ankles. His body was lean and sinewy. It seemed to carry a muscle memory of violence. The elf was dressed in a filthy military-style gambeson that was still wet with blood. Long, pointed ears protruded from the greasy silver hair that hung down between his knees. His torn breeches were soaked dark from the puddle of piss he was sitting in. He either didn't notice or didn't care. Leafwater could hear the dark figure muttering quietly to himself in a mad polemic that slipped between the common Eastern and Elvish. He seemed to be singing snippets of a marching jody that soldiers used to keep their feet in step. It was filled with a colourful slew of invectives and graphic descriptions of mythic genitalia. The reek that came off him could be smelled across the distance, booze and piss, and some other smell like burning. The entire situation sat very ill with Doran. In Arathes especially, elves were to be publicly venerated. He had always been taught that elves were supposed to comport themselves with ethereal grace and gentle dignity, at least where others could see. They were called to be higher than any other species but the Lyn Tyrians, never given to the base desires of their lessers like drunkenness, and especially not murder. His mother's gossip notwithstanding, Doran had been around enough elves to see a fair amount of propaganda in those assertions. But this was an unprecedented situation. There was indeed something eminently wrong with this elf, and it made Doran suddenly happy being as far away from him as possible. The elf moved suddenly to scratch his cheek, and Doran saw the sergeant flinch. It then occurred to him that this veteran sergeant was actually scared. He was doing his best to hide it, but he had wide eyes and his knuckles were white around the cudgel's grip. This sent a slew of troubling questions through his mind. Who really was this elf? Were they in danger? If something did happen, could this geriatric old human even do anything? Then Doran would be left to defend himself against a murderous elf, and what would happen then? The answers to all of these were less than comforting. The only thing he could think to do was firmly establish his authority. He knew elves, and they preferred order. He was the ranking partisan, after all. He just needed to sound like he was in charge. "Watch that prisoner, Sergeant," Lieutenant Leafwater said, lowering his voice in an effort to sound commanding. "Keep your eye on the market, Leafwater," the sergeant snapped. "If I hear another slossing word out of you, I'll have you standing watch on Latrine Row so long you'll never get the stink of skit out of your fancy greys." Doran Leafwater blanched like he'd been slapped. A lilting giggle came from somewhere high and sweet, perhaps pleasant in any situation but this one. Both men realized the source at the same time. The elf was laughing. An icy shiver raced up Doran's spine. "You let a human talk to you that way, brother?" the suspect challenged in High Elvish. "Quiet, you!" Sergeant Hobb pinged the wall with his club near the elf's head. The suspect didn't even flinch. Hobb turned back to Leafwater. "Just be ready to hail the reinforcements and fill them in on our situation, Lieutenant." Hobb spoke more measuredly. "And what situation is that?" Two men in long capes suddenly melted out of the darkness of the lower market bazaar. Lieutenant Doran Leafwater gave a startled yelp and nearly added to the list of people in the vicinity who'd recently wet themselves. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.